Hello, welcome to Monday's edition of Cracking the Cryptic, and today we are going to look at normal Killer Sudoku, plain old Killer Sudoku. And this is a puzzle I would like to cover more on the channel than we do, but actually finding good quality handcrafted Killer Sudokus isn't easy. They aren't two a penny, especially of the required difficulty. And this one actually has a bit of serendipity attached to it. We had an email from one of our patrons, Gordon Glenn, asking us to cover a Killer Sudoku and to sort of go through some of the basic tips and techniques. And coincidentally, I had another email from William Andrews saying he just created this puzzle and published it on Logic Masters Germany, and it's running at a 90% approval rating. So I know that this Killer Sudoku is of high quality, and therefore it should be a very nice puzzle for us to look at today. Now, before we start that though, this is an interesting day for Cracking the Cryptic. We have 3 videos going live today, believe it or not. We've got this one. We've got one later on tonight, which Mark is going to host on Ashish Kumar's linked Sudoku series. I think this is going to be the 3rd of the 4 videos covering those remarkable puzzles, and they are remarkable. Tomorrow's video will reveal why they are remarkable, so do check that out. But also, we were delighted earlier on to host our great friend Neil Talbot's video on how to solve puzzle hunts. Now, many of you out there were intrigued by the puzzle hunts we published recently. We did a junior one and an adult one, but you've never done puzzle hunts before, and you were sort of, what do I do? Why are there no instructions? How do I solve this? Well, Neil actually designed the adult puzzle hunt, and he takes you through how to work out the solution. And in that video, there is so much information that is useful for puzzle hunting generally. It is a must watch. It really is great fun. And having watched it, it may help you with the other puzzle hunt puzzle that we've got published at the moment on Patreon. It's not behind the paywall, it's completely free. And it's by a young viewer by the name of Nicolas Rasmussen from Montreal, and he's created a beautiful puzzle. It really is great. We've had about 6 correct answers to it so far, and all of them have raved about it. So watch Neil's video, go and try Nicolas's puzzle, and honestly, you'll have had a good day as a result of that. Now, with that, let's turn our attention to this Killer Sudoku from William, and if you want to have a go, click on the link under the video as always, and that will take you to our webpage where you can play along. Let's get cracking. Now, before I start to solve this, the first thing I hope all of you know about Killer Sudoku is the rule of 45. That you have to know it, and that derives from the fact that every row, every column, and every 3x3 box in a Sudoku contains the digits 1 to 9. If you add up the digits 1 to 9, you get 45. So we can use that fact to basically give ourselves so much information from the given clues here. So if I look at this puzzle, let me stare at this for a second, and right, well, we can write in the value of that cell, therefore that cell, that cell, that cell, that cell, that cell. There may be others as well I'm missing there, but immediately straight off the bat, just by doing some very simple maths, we can write 7 answers into this Sudoku. If you can't see why, maybe pause the video and have a think about it. It uses this 45 rule. I'll highlight those squares. Look, we can highlight them. And then, so my job first is going to be to deduce the value of these cells. Let's start with this one. So, I know this row adds to 45. So does this row. So does this row. So these 3 rows together add up to 135. Can't remember if I said 45 or 35, but the rows add up to 45. So, those 3 rows add up to 135. Now, if we actually look, it's quite good here because the highlighting of the top 3 rows has sort of emphasized these white numbers, the cages. Now, the cages entirely encompass the first 3 rows of the grid, with the exception that this 36 cage here sticks out into that cell. So if I add up all of these cage totals, I'm going to get a number that is very slightly bigger than 135. And the difference between those cage totals and 135 must go into this little cell here. So let's do that. So we've got 36, 56, 86, 96, 102, 138. So these cages add up to 138. So this square here has got to be a 3 in order to ensure that we've got the right number in the first 3 rows, which must add to 135. The 3 tells us that these 6 yellow squares must add up to 33, i.e. the difference between 36 and 3. And if these add up to 33, and I add 11 to that, I get 44. But I know this 3 by 3 box adds to 45, so that square has got to be a 1. Therefore that square's got to be an 8. Now this 8 tells us something about the 15 cage here, but I don't want to do that. I want to carry on with geometry for the first bit. So let's look at this 3 here and think about what it tells us about this square. So we know that these 10 cells, all of the row plus this one, add up to 23 plus 24 plus 3, that's 50. But if I know the 9 cells in the row add up to 45, that cell has got to be a 5. And we can do exactly the same thing. Look, it's a nice start to this puzzle. It's a nice sort of stepping down that we're using to go through the grid. So again, we've got 10 cells here. We know these 9 add up to 45. 18 plus 29 is 47, plus 5 is 52. This square here has got to be a 7. Now this square we could have got in 2 ways. We can get it using this 7 and this row, dipping into this cell, or we could have actually done the row trick on the bottom 3 rows, look. Because if we'd added up all of the cages in the bottom 3 rows, we would have got a number very slightly less than 135, because these cages they only deal with those cells there. So we would have been able to isolate the value of this by looking at the difference between 135 and these cages. But that's going to be more arithmetic than if we just do it with the row here. So let's use the row here. You can see we've got 15, 28, 47, 47 plus 7 is 54. So that square has got to be a 9. Why can we write in the value of this square? Well, we know this box adds to 45. We've got 18 plus 14, that's 32, plus 9 is 41. Therefore, that's got to be a 4 to make 45. We can therefore write in the value of that one, which I forgot to highlight, but you get the idea. So we get to this point straight away just by using our 45 rule. And now we have to think harder. So what would I be looking at next? Well, I would look for cage totals that are restricted. So we have a 17 cage total here. That must be 8 and 9. We have a 6 cage total here that can't use a 1. So these 2 squares must be 2 and 4. We have a 15 cage total here that can't use an 8. So that must be 6 and 9. And now we can do a Sudoku trick, look, because we have 9s locked into row 1 and row 2 in this 3 by 3 box. And in this 3 by 3 box, we have 9s also locked into row 1 and row 2. So where does the 9 go in row 3? Well, it can't go in any of these squares. So it must be in one of those 2 squares there. Oh, and now we can use geometry again. This 3 cannot repeat in its cage. So all of these 6 yellow squares here cannot contain a 3. So where are we going to put a 3 in this box? It has to be now in the 11 cage, which means it must join its friend the 8 to add up to 11. So we get a 3-8 pair there. Okay, so that's what I can see that's easy. This 8 cage down here, look, can't be 3, 5, can't be 1, 7. So those two squares have got to be 2 and 6. Now I'm a little bit stuck in the sense that I can't see anything an easy picking at this stage. So what would I do in this situation? Well, I'm going to look here, and the reason I'm going to look here is I've got 5 digits in this box, so I know what values those 4 digits have got to have. They're going to have to be 1, 3, 5, 7. And we can do some, now we can just do some work with the arithmetic here. So let's ask ourselves, is it possible that there isn't a 1 in those 3 cells? Well, if there was no 1, these would be 3, 5 and 7, and they would already add to 15 without taking into account this cell. So I know actually there must be a 1 in one of those 3 squares, which means there is not a 1 in this square. Now, there's a 7 possibility in this cage, but if there was a 7 in this cell, these 2 squares would have to add up to 3, so they'd have to be 1 and 2. And this one can't be a 1 or a 2 because of the digits already in row 3. So this cannot be a 7. So now we know that this 15 cage contains a 7 and it contains a 1. So the other 2 cells are going to either have to be 3, 4 or 5, 2. And that means this square has to be a 2 or a 4. This is either going to be 1, 7, 3, that's going to be a 4, or it's going to be 1, 7, 5, and this is going to be a 2. And there's a 4 down here. So that square actually is a 2, which means the option here must be 1, 5 and 7. So there's no 3 in there. This is therefore a 3. And that helps with the 10 cage, because we know these 2 cells therefore have to add up to 7. We can't repeat a 3 in the cage, so these cannot be 3 and 4. They can't be 2 and 5, so these 2 squares have to be 1 and 6 to make 7, and there's a 1 there. So actually that is a 1, that is a 6. It's not a 1 now. The 5 here is nice. I can't put a 5 in any of those 3 squares, but I need to put a 5 in this box, so it's going to have to go there. That locks a 5 down into the 18 cage. And that is useful. So once we know this 18 cage here contains a 5, we know we need to put 2 more digits in here that add up to 13. We don't know where they go, but we know that those 2 digits must add up to 13. Well, they can't be 9 and 4. There's already a 9 in this box. And we can't repeat the 5, so they also can't be 5 and 8. So the only way of making these 3 squares add up to 18 without repeating digits is going to be if they are 5, 6 and 7. And there's a 6 there. So that is going to have to be a 6. These 2 squares have to be 5 and 7. We now know there's a 6 in one of those 2 positions. This 6 forces the 6 and the 2, over on this side. One of these actually that square must be a 6 because we have a 6 up there. And these 3 squares now, if we look at this column carefully, you can see we've got effectively 6 digits catered for. So these squares have got to be 3, 8 and 9. One of those 2 squares is an 8. And now the 19 cage is forced. What do I mean by that? Well, we have a 9 in it, so I know these 2 squares have got to add up to 10. But what options are available? Well, we can't use, because of these 3 squares being 3, 8 and 9, These two squares can't be 1, 9, 2, 8 or 3, 7. So they have to be 4 and 6. And we know that this one can't be a 6. So this one has to be. That's a 6. That's a 4. These three squares are therefore 1, 2 and 7 in some order. And let me just take a stare at this again. Let's see if we can see anything easy. This 3, that was easy. I could have got my 3 and my 8 fixed there. Sorry about that. No doubt you've been looking at that, telling me to do it for a while. This must be a 6 now. One of those two squares now must be a 6. 7, 4 into one of those squares. We don't know where that is. Let's look at these three squares and just get them pencil marked. You can see these have to be 3, 4 and 7. So this can't be a 7. This 8 actually forces that one to be the 8. And this has to be a 1 or a 2. These have to be 1, 2 or 3 to make sure this adds up to 14. That 3 means that square can't be a 3. This 4 here means that one can't be a 4, and that one can't be a 3 either because of the 3 over there. So this one actually is a 3. These two squares have got to be 9 and 7 in some order. And these squares have got to be 2, 4 and 5, and there's a 2 up here. So we get the 2, and we can pencil mark the 4 and the 5. 7 here resolves to 7 and 9. These two squares have got to be 1 and 8. And there's an 8 down there. So this square is an 8. This is a 1. And there's all sorts of things going on now. So I think, to be honest, I'm going to be surprised if we haven't cracked the back of this puzzle now, because you can see this 1 forces this square to be a 1, which means this is a 2 and this is a 3. This is a 1, and the 2, 7 is left up here unsolved. But more importantly than that is that this 8 here has joined a 7 in this 18 cage. So we know these two squares add up to 15. These two squares have got to add up to 3. So they must be 1 and 2. We have a 1 there. So that's a 1. That's a 2. That must be a 6, unwinding our earlier pencil marks. This must be a 6 by Sudoku. This 2 sees these two squares. Well, that's got to be 2 and 7 now, in that order. These squares have got to be 3, 8 and 9 to complete... actually, no, just let me correct that. That can't be 8 there, so we need a 3, 4 and 9. Nearly made a mistake. That one can't be 9 because of the 9 in the column. And these squares here have got to be 4, 5 and 9. And there's a 4 here, so that one must be the 4. These two are 5 and 9. The moment we see these two are 5 and 9, this one has got to be a 1 to make sure we get to 15. Must be a 1 in one of those two squares. Now we've got 4 and 6 here in the 24 cage. So 4 and 6 add up to 10. So these two squares have got to add up to 14 without using a 6. So these two squares are 5 and 9, and the 9 at the top here tells us the order. That forces that one to be a 9. This can't be a 9 now. That can't be a 9. The 3 over here tells us what the order is of the 3 and the 8. That square's got to be a 7. And these two squares have got to be 2 and 8. And again, we get the ordering nicely. That fixes the 2 and the 4. Now we can use geometry look to tell us the value of this square. There's probably a few ways of doing this, but if we look at this box, We've got a 24 cage covering those cells, plus 8, well that's 32. Therefore, to get to 45, these must equal 13. So if we look at this column now, we've got the yellow squares adding to 13, 14, 19, 27, 33, 42. So this square must be 3 in order to ensure the column adds up to 45. We still need to place a 9 in this column. We have a 9 here, so that one is the only place a 9 can go. This square must be a 1 or a 5. These squares are 2, 4 and 7. We have 2's there and there, so we get the 2 into this square. These 2 are 4 and 7. 4 here tells us that that order is that way. These add up to 9, so these two have got to add up to 13 without using 5, 8 and without using 6 and 7. So these are 4 and 9. You can see the order is forced again. That 9 fixes the 9 and the 5. It's interesting as well, if you look at the geometry here, the top of the grid is only going to be resolved by resolving this square. So we're going to have to get this square in order to unwind the top of the grid here. It's quite cool. This square, what's that going to be? 7. That fixes the 7 and the 5 over here, and in fact that's going to do it. That gives us the 1, that's the 5, that's the 7 now. This must be a 1. This 7 fixes the 7 and the 4. That fixes the 4 and the 5. These two squares are going to have to be, what's that going to be? 3 and 5, so that's in that order. That must be a 3. We're left with placing 8 and 5 into those squares, so I think that's going to be like that. And that's how to solve the puzzle. That does look like it's correct. So there you go. A bit of a primer on Killer Sudoku. Very nice puzzle from William. Enjoyed that very much. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Do let us know in the comments. Do give us feedback on the puzzle, so that, I mean, it's very important, I think, when constructors go to the trouble of making these brilliant puzzles, that they get feedback on them. So do try and give a comment if you can. And we'll be back next time with another edition of Cracking the Cryptic.